Seminar number 6, Study Design Basics. After all, the ultimate goal of all research is not objectivity, but truth. As we've already learned, the ultimate objective of all studies is to learn truth in the universe. By thoughtfully reflecting on the findings in a study, we can infer that truth. The early chapters of the Holy Book provide an excellent introduction to this idea and are well worth reading and rereading a few times, especially Chapter 1, where the basic anatomy and physiology of clinical study design are described. To infer truth with a worthwhile study, the scientific method should be used. Although procedures vary from one field of inquiry to another, identifiable features distinguish scientific inquiry from other methods of obtaining knowledge. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the scientific method is a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. Scientific investigators propose hypotheses as explanations of phenomena and design experimental studies to test these hypotheses. The steps in these studies must be repeatable to predict future results. Scientific inquiry is generally intended to be as objective as possible to reduce biased interpretation of study findings. The flowchart on this slide depicts the basic scientific method. We've already examined step 1 in an earlier seminar, asking a question. It is important to emphasize that no one has ever carried out a perfect study, but good studies follow this scientific method. It is also important to remember that in some ways the scientific method is an endless loop, where the results of one study lead to conclusions that require us to develop new hypotheses and carry out subsequent studies. So with each study we get closer and closer to truth in the universe. During the course of this program, we'll examine many different study designs. The choice of study design depends on the population of interest and the question being asked. A perfect study would include the entire world population as participants to determine truth in the universe. Since we know that is an impossibility, we instead need to select a sample that is hopefully a representative one and choose the appropriate study design that will answer the question being asked. We'll master each of these study designs by the end of the series. Don Berwick, a researcher from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and an active participant in healthcare policy development for this country, wrote in a JAMA editorial in 2008, "Where is the randomized trial is, for many purposes, the right question, but for many others it is the wrong question, a myopic one." This is a terrific insight. Far too many rigid practitioners are only willing to believe findings from randomized clinical trials, but depending on the sample studied and the question being asked, truth can be inferred with a high level of certainty from a non-randomized clinical trial as long as the study is designed well. Study design can be categorized as observational, where no intervention is done, or experimental, where the investigator manipulates the conditions in an effort to minimize bias and maximize chances of learning truth. A study can also be categorized as hypothesis formulation or hypothesis testing. It is important to know your own goals when choosing a design to answer your question. As mentioned earlier, no study is perfect. Errors are an inherent part of all studies. Errors are either random or systematic. Random errors occur from random events in the world. They cannot be predicted or controlled since they are unpredictable. Luckily, random errors rarely bias a study unfairly. Systematic errors, however, can be anticipated and need to be addressed early because they can unfairly bias the findings in a study. These systematic errors can occur at the level of the observer recording measurements during the course of a study. Systematic error can occur at the level of the subject, where the subject's actions unfairly bias the results of a study, and systematic error can occur at the level of the instrument, where the instrument itself unfairly biases the findings of the study. We will discuss each of these types of systematic error over the course of these seminars. Sometimes investigators are tempted to allow biases into their study to make them more feasible and easier to complete, but that can lead to poor validity of the findings. The key is finding the right balance between feasibility and validity when planning your study, and doing so is not easy. Since we're on the subject of validity, what exactly does that mean? Validity means how well a measurement or study represents the actual phenomenon of interest. Internal validity means you have reliable measures of your independent and dependent variables and are able to exclude the effect of extraneous variables or confounders cleanly in your study. External validity is the ability to generalize your results to other subjects or situations outside of the arena where you carried out your study. We'll talk more about validity during the course of this seminar series. To conclude, this schematic from Hulley nicely depicts the physiology of a study. No matter what type of study design is chosen, most studies need to follow this specific physiology. Findings in a study are used to infer truth in the study, and from there we can infer truth in the universe. In the next seminar, we'll talk about navigating the IRB.